The first thing I want to do is remove the wheel, so take off all 5 of your lug nuts with a 21mm socket. Now take the wheel off. If it's stuck on here, go ahead and put a lug nut back on so it doesn't fall off, and then use a rubber mallet and hit it from the backside. That should pop it right off. Take the lug nut off now that the wheel is free. Go ahead and wiggle it off of here. All right, take the wheel off. Now to start the brake job, I'm going to take off these two 13mm bolts which hold the caliper onto the bracket. And then if you have to, you can use a pry bar and just pry the caliper right off of the bracket and off the pads, and I'm going to put it on top of the upper control arm here, tie it with a bungee cord. That way I'm not putting any pressure on my brake hose. You don't want this to stretch and get damaged. Now you can take the pads off. And now we have to remove the bracket from the knuckle. Use an 18mm socket, take these 2 bolts out. Take the bracket off. Next we have to take off the rotor. Mine is super stuck on here, so what I'm going to do is put on the lug nut and then hammer it so that I can have it pop free, but the lug nut will prevent it from going flying off and hurting me. Take off the safety lug nut and remove your rotor. At this point in the next clip, you will see that I have a new hub installed, and obviously you don't have to replace the hub just when you do your brakes, but you do want to clean it up. So this one, the way it looks right now, is way too dirty for me to put a rotor back on. So I have a sanding disc, and if I were keeping this hub, I would sand it down to have nice clean metal. Doesn't have to look brand new, but it has to be flat. If you don't have a flat mounting surface, your rotor will not sit flush, and then you'll have braking issues down the road. So what I would do is take the sanding disc like I said. Now if yours isn't as bad, you could just use a wire brush, but whatever you have to do to get it clean, do that, and then we will coat it with some antiseize. Okay, so this spot right here, that's basically what I would be aiming for. That looks very clean to me. Yes, it doesn't look brand new because it's stained, but it is flat, it is nice and clean, so this is what I would be aiming for the rest of the hub if I wasn't replacing it. Next we need to cover up the surface of the hub with antiseize. So I'm going to put a very thin layer on. You don't want to put too much, you don't want it to start flinging out onto the rotor, onto the brakes at higher speeds. And it's important to get on this inner ring here, this lip. If the rotor will seize on from rust, that's where it's going to seize on most likely. So focus on that area, but of course cover the rest of it as well. It's important for the rotor to sit flush over time, otherwise you get braking issues, braking pulsations, and that's not great. And rust buildup will cause that. Now take your rotor, put it on backwards, and that is so that we can clean off the oils that are on the outside of it, which come there from the factory so that it doesn't rust while it's sitting on the shelf waiting to be purchased. So clean those off with some brake parts cleaner. And you want to take it and flip it over, install your rotor, clean up this area as well. Now with our caliper bracket on the workbench, I want to start by removing the anti-rattle clips. You can use a little screwdriver or pry bar to get these off. Do this to both sides. And I'm going to clean up the area here where the pads sit. Mine isn't too rusty, so a wire brush will do the trick. A lot of times you'll have to sand this down because it's rotted, and you want to get all of that debris off, all of that rust off, so that the pads have a nice area to sit and slide on. Now yes, you do put on new anti-rattle clips over, but if there's a lot of rust buildup here, it'll actually squeeze the pads in between the two sides as it builds up, and then they won't slide in and out smoothly. So do the same to both sides. I'm going to take a little bit of brake grease and coat these areas. I don't want any exposed metal here because rust will build up in that case and will cause issues further down the road. But you don't want to put too much grease on here. Of course, you want to do this to both sides, because if you put too much, it'll squeeze out onto the rotor, and then you have grease on your rotor, and that is not what you want. That's not good. So just put a thin layer, and then you can take your new anti-rattle clips, slide these on just like this, press them down all the way, make sure they sit here and lock in, and do the same to the other side. Next thing I want to do is pull out the slider pins. And as you can see, I still have a lot of grease on mine. It's pretty fresh grease, so that's telling me that someone probably recently did this brake job. So I'm going to wipe this off and just apply new grease. Now, if yours were rusted, seized, if they had debris in here, you would want to clean them up and inspect them. Make sure they kind of look like this after you clean them up. If they're rotted, you need to replace them because they are not safe to be reused. And if you had rust built up in here, you would want to take a bore brush, take the boot off, take a bore brush and clean in here. I'm not going to do that just because mine are good. There's grease on this little lip here. Make sure that it's greased up. If there isn't, put some on. And then same with this lip right here. You can see there's a little bit of rust buildup, so I'm going to take my wire brush and just brush that off. There isn't a lot, but you want to make sure that that's clean, because if the boot doesn't seal up properly in there with grease, then water gets in and rusts out the whole thing. So there we go. That looks a lot better. So I'm going to apply some grease to the slider pin, nice thin coating, and the reason you don't want a ton is because if you put too much, it'll just get washed off by the boot as you try to insert it into the caliper. Make sure that grease makes its way up here, and then I'm going to put some grease on the inside of the boot here. That's going to act as a reserve of grease basically for my caliper. Work it into the boot. Now slide the slider pin in, press it through all the way. Make sure it bottoms out and squeeze the boot to release any excess grease and air that might be stuck in here, and then do the same to this other side. Now take your caliper bracket, slide in the two bolts. Don't put any grease or antiseize on these. If you're going to put anything, use thread locker. Let's bottom these out. 136 foot-pounds for both of these bolts. And 2. Now grab your pads, slide them in like this. Make sure they slide in easy. If they don't, it's because there's too much rust built up here and they're getting crushed, and you need to clean more up. Put in both the inner and the outer. Now, I should have mentioned this, but the inner gets a wear indicator, which will sit on the top of the inner pad. Now you want to take your caliper, inspect it to make sure it's still in good condition. And what I want to do next is take off this clip right here. It's got a little spring clip that just hooks on. I'm going to use a little pry bar and just remove it. There we go. We'll put a new one on in a second. Before we do though, I'm going to push back the two pistons. This is a dual piston caliper, so I'm going to use my caliper depression tool that works for a dual piston caliper and squeeze it back very, very slowly. If you don't have this tool, what you can use is a large pair of pliers. Just make sure that you're going slowly and make sure it pushes back smooth. If it does not push back smoothly, it's most likely because your caliper is seized and you need a new one. Okay, once it's pushed back all the way, take this off, and I'm going to apply some grease to the outer ring of the two pistons here, just a little bit, not a lot. This will help the brakes operate quietly and smoothly. Do the same thing to these ears here. And now in the center here, you want to take your new clip, spring clip, and just press it on firmly until it's fully seated. There we go, just like that. Now you can take your caliper, slide it over the bracket and over the pads, line it up with the slider pins. Let's put in the mounting bolts. Start in the two mounting bolts, bottom them out. And the torque for these is anywhere between 21 and 26 foot-pounds. So I'm just gonna go for 25 on the higher end. And again, thread locker, not grease or antiseize if you're gonna put anything on these threads. Let's put the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts and torque them to 150 foot-pounds. That is if you have the 5 lug wheel pattern. If you have 7 lugs, then you want to torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Double check them. There you have it.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.